Right, I've had the go ahead to start when I'm ready. So welcome everybody. My name's Natalie Hogg. I'm the director of the Transparency International Defence and Security Programme. I will be moderating this session along with Saladin Hashim, who is the Defence and Security Programme Manager for CISLAC in Nigeria. Before just introducing the session, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. Would really like speakers to try to stick to their time so that this doesn't run over. And I'll do the uncomfortable job of trying to intervene if it's running over. So forgive me in advance if I interrupt anybody. If everybody could please mute their microphones when they're not speaking and turn off their cameras, that would be really, really helpful as well. And just to let you all know that the session will be recorded, and that if you have any questions, you can put those into the chat box in Zoom, which will be moderated. So I hope that's all clear, and I hope everybody can hear me okay. So, as I said, I'm the director of the Transparency International Defence and Security Programme. It's really great to have this session, which is focused on how civilian oversight can be used as a corrective for corruption in the defence sector, and to have two of TIDS's key partners in two key countries, Nigeria and Ukraine, as part of it. So as probably most of you know, the TI Defence and Security is a global sectoral programme of Transparency International that focuses on corruption in the defence sector. And we do a variety of work focused on both governments and industry and with militaries, seeking to mitigate risks in a sector that is at high risk of corruption, both because of the size of the financial incentives for corruption in the sector, and also because the often secretive nature of the defence sector. As well as working globally and regionally, we work with a range of countries around the world, Nigeria and Ukraine being two of them, but we also work in the US, with Tunisia, with Mali and Ghana. And within that, we have a range of different approaches and examples of how civilian oversight can be used to reduce corruption risks. So I'd like to then just introduce the speakers who we have today. I've introduced Saladin already, who's going to moderate. We've got Olena Trega from NATO in Ukraine, who's the executive director. Hi, Olena.
Hello, Natalie, and everyone.
John Sunday Ojo, who's a Nuffic Fellow at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, Netherlands.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, thank you. It's good actually if people do just wave, because names aren't always up, so that's really helpful, thank you. Dr. Jeremy Lonsdale, who's the director of the National Audit Office in the UK, which is fantastic because that gives us another comparative country here. Hello. Jeremy's still not on. I've just had a text. Okay, let's hope Jeremy gets on. He's having the same problem as I'm having. If there's anybody who's not muted their microphone, please could you do that, because there's a little bit of background feedback. Thank you. And John Speller, MP and Vice Chairman of the Commons Defence Committee in the UK.
Hello.
Hi, John. So now I'm going to hand over to Mr. Hashim from CISLAC in Nigeria to introduce himself and some of CISLAC's work.
All right, thank you very much, Natalie, and good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this very important event. This afternoon, we intend to look at civilian oversight in the defense sector. And of course, like Natalie already mentioned, my name is Salahuddin Hashim. I work for Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. CISLAC is
Saladin, can I just stop you there? There's quite a lot of feedback coming over. I don't know if that's affecting other people as well, or if it's just me. Is it affecting other people?
Okay. I think I can also hear myself back. Should I remove this?
There's feedback. Yeah.
Is it okay now?
That's better, actually.
Okay. All right. So sorry about that. So I'll just quickly run through that. CISLAC is a Pan-African civil society organization that has worked in the areas of defense and security in the last 1 decade. And of course, the essence is for us to be able to provide some level of conducive environment for a responsive, effective, and efficient defense and security sector. And of course, this is because we believe very strongly that the nature and character of a nation's defense are critical to the establishment of democratic values and ethos in the polity. And that in itself has really informed the essence why CISLAC had taken, for instance, the issue of civilian oversight very seriously. And of course, for a country that has been under military interregnum for 33 years, it becomes very important for us to look at a young democratic institutions in the parliament and see how we can begin to build capacity for parliamentarians to engage more constructively. As we all know, liberal democracies have it very strongly that parliamentary oversight is a cornerstone of a democratic control in the of the armed forces. So it becomes very important for us to take this in a manner that we can actually key into. As we all know, it is also been established very strongly that openness is fundamental to the political health of a modern state. And we believe that this has actually formed the fulcrum why we need to take this conversation a little bit more forward. And of course, having a fledgling democratic experience that has span up until 15, 20 years now, it requires that we have a security sector that is under the watchdog of a legislative body that is alive to the performance of its oversight function over the nation's armed forces. In the last 1 decade, we have a legislature or oversight institutions that are very weak in terms of oversight, in terms of understanding values and the culture of how this defense and security sector actually functions. And that in itself has created a lot of challenge in terms of budgeting, has created overlap in terms of effectiveness, in terms of human rights violations, and we have had quite a number of setbacks when it comes to the issues that borders around oversight. So these are some of the major issues that we intend to look at today and many more. And of course, like Natalie already mentioned, we are just moderating this session and we have very fantastic speakers, which she already introduced. They are going to take turns to have this conversation and give us a little bit more dive into what we expect for the next an hour and a half. So without wasting much of your time, would I request Ole to please take the floor and provide us with some conversation around her experience from the Ukraine. And before she does that, I would like to also enjoin participants to look at the dashboard and try as much as possible to fill in a number of files that are materials and resources that are useful for read. And of course, in addition to that, there are also polls.
Hello. Should I start now, or could I?
Yes, please go ahead, Elena. Please do start.
Because it's unclear whether.
Over to you.
Okay. He froze. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really excited to join this panel and to be able to share the experience from the field of my organization, NICO, how we managed to actually achieve some tangible results within the last 3 years of our existence. To begin with, I just want to mention the context, since we have a broader audience here. In Ukraine basically is an Eastern European country. It is a democratic country, yet it has a very heavy post-Soviet heritage, and this heritage is especially felt in the defense and security sector, because it was never a tradition in Soviet Union to have a civil society NGO to claim that they are overseeing, obviously, the defense sector. That would be something unseen. And it's a post-communist country transitioning towards Euro-Atlantic values. At the same time, it is a country at war. In 2014, Russian aggression started against Ukraine, first with the annexation of Crimea, and then with a hybrid war in the east of Ukraine. And we currently, since then, have ongoing military conflict. Of course, these circumstances created an atmosphere and created a situation when there was really a need in Ukrainian society to have an organization like us. We were established in 2016 by Transparency International DS and Transparency International Ukraine as a project to tackle corruption in Ukraine's defense sector. At that time, the defense budget was growing rapidly from 1% of GDP to 5% of GDP. And due to the ongoing military conflict, we also observed the significant increase in procurement of armaments, which is, according to Ukrainian legislation, always a classified procurement. So we essentially saw a larger share of the defense budget spent through a classified procedure under the veil of secrecy. And of course, I did not mention another characteristic of Ukraine that you probably heard, that it is considered to be one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, if not the most corrupt country in Europe, and according to Transparency International index. And of course, unnecessarily to explain, the defense budget, defense resources became an interesting area for the Ukrainian corrupt officials, corrupt military, corrupt politicians. And as the budgets were increasing, the corruption was increasing. NICO works our model of work is evidence-based advocacy. So we research different topics, and then we basically conclude what is happening in this area, how corruption is happening, and how we can help close the space for corruption. We suggest concrete policies. So, for example, I would use a case that we were researching for several years, the defense procurement, and we published the reports. They are available for their audience. I gave the PDF files, but they are also available on NICO.org.ua website. And those reports were about open procurements that are happening on our digital platform, Prozoro, which is supposed to reduce opportunities for corruption, to give transparency, but still, in case of defense procurement, transparency was not enough, unfortunately. So we analyzed open procurements. The report was called 6 Red Flags in Defense Procurement. And then later, we analyzed the process of classified procurement, which in Ukraine is called State Defense Order. And it covers absolutely almost everything, 95% of armaments and technical equipment. So we concluded that the scale of corruption is very serious. Our interviewees told us that around 30 to 40% on each procurement is lost due to inefficiency or corruption. We analyzed other sectors such as housing and construction, because our Ministry of Defense is responsible for constructing service and permanent housing for the armed forces. And they have a significant budget for this, but the report of the auditing service of Ukraine concluded that around 50% of this money is lost due to inefficiency and corruption. And very often it is hard to tell the difference between inefficiency and corruption. And corruption. So the scale was very serious. And of course, if we speak about the oversight, formally in Ukraine, we have, like in every democratic country, we have a parliament, we have the committee that is devoted to defense, security and intelligence, and they are overseeing this sector, yet the parliamentary oversight is very weak, because also it was not in Soviet tradition to empower the parliamentarians for this function. It was a very closed sector controlled by KGB, and we are only now acquiring this culture of members of parliament publicly questioning Minister of Defense about certain procurements, about certain corruption scandals in a public manner. We also, of course, have the auditing chamber, audit service of Ukraine, and they publish a lot of reports about corruption in defense. They do not publish reports about classified areas, such as, for example, report on defense procurement of armaments. There is such report, but they didn't publish it. But in the reports that they do publish, there are a lot of recommendations to the Ministry of Defense, to other institutions in the sector, to basically change the processes, to implement policies which are different from the current policies. But these recommendations, first of all, are never publicized broadly, nobody knows them, and also they are not followed. So this is the problem. So to summarize, I would say that the formal system of the oversight is very weak in Ukraine. And at the same time, Ukraine is also known as a country where there is a very vibrant and very strong civil society. And when NICO was created, for us, it wasn't really a challenge to prove that we can also perform an oversight in this sector. We are part of the society, and NICO is perceived as a very serious body, and the impact of our oversight is much more visible, much more publicized than impact of the formal oversight structures, because, you know, we are an advocacy group. We have very active media engagement, very actively. We speak publicly about different issues. We use publicity and media to move difficult topics where there is strong resistance of the system. For example, we're working in the area of changing the secrecy legislation in Ukraine, and Ukrainian Security Service is the institution which is one of the least reformed institutions. It is the successor of the Soviet KGB, and currently our international partners are trying to push the reform there, but it is very delayed. And also this same institution is controlling the issue of management of secret information, which is the topic, which is the theme going through all our basically reports. If there is high level of classification, this classification is not justified in different areas of defense sector. Of course, it's a ground. It gives more ground for corruption. Of course, this system should be changed, and only the information which is really necessary, which is supposed to be kept closed for the reasons of national security, should stay closed. I'd like also, opportunities and threats for the NGOs. Like I said, in Ukraine, this sector is very new for NGOs, and we were the organization that was coming first into this sector. And there was at first like small resistance from the institutions, from government officials who have not seen this kind of engagement of civil society into this sector before. But now it became completely easy, completely legitimate, and we are invited to all major working groups when the legislation is drafted. We are invited to the nomination committees when the directors of defense companies are selected. I used this case of procurement when we were researching and publishing on this topic. It gave us basically opportunity later when the government changed in Ukraine in 2019, when the new president was elected, President Zelensky. And it gave us opportunity to basically help implement our own policy recommendations. And we were in a working group helping to draft the new law on defense procurement, which is more in line with Euro-Atlantic standards of transparency, accountability, free and open competition. And this law was adopted this year in summer. And this is part of our work. It's a very successful case, but now we are struggling a bit with the implementation of this law. But here also we are working and looking how we should go about this task, how we can push for this implementation if the government structures are reluctant and unwilling and behind the schedule with this implementation.
Elena, sorry, just to try and keep us on time, could you maybe just make some concluding remarks, and then hopefully there'll be more time for discussion at the end. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, I am already at concluding remarks, so like I have 1 minute according to my watch. Sure. Just one more thing. Ukrainian civil society cooperates very much with the international partners, with the embassies. Now G7, Big Seven, these countries are now helping to push for reforms, and we are helping also to shape conditionalities for international assistance, for security assistance. This is very effective tool. And the lesson learned, my concluding remark, which I'd like to share, is that it is very important for a civil society organization in this field to adjust to the political situation in the country very quickly. We were established as oversight body, and we were doing this external oversight when the opportunity came, and this opportunity was very short. For 6 months after the new government was in place, we were able to provide essentially technical assistance to the government to help push for our own reform. And then later we're switching back more into the oversight mode as the pace of reform slows down, as it always happens. So I think this is our major lesson that we understood and would like to share. And I would be happy to answer more questions and hear to other experiences.
All right, thank you very much, Olena. That was Olena Tregub, the Executive Director of NECO. If you are just joining us, thank you very much for sharing those thoughts. Without running the risk of trying to summarize what you have said, but I particularly like the description of the paradox where you mentioned that the increase in budgets often translate to a higher risk of corruption, and of course it further increases the risk of corruption, and of course the issue of access to information, which you also describe, is weak, and there's a need to do a whole lot around that. And of course that is also a function of weak oversight. And of course I'm happy that you are now being recognized and being invited to some strategic meetings where you can now do procurement monitoring. And of course the issue of classification is something that also requires some additional work. I think it also needs some additional capacity that needs to be built. And of course, in your technical support that you provide, I think it is very important for you to begin to unbundle some aspect that would even strengthen effectiveness, and even the reform that comes very slowly, support and ensuring that that also is accelerated. Thank you very much for those thoughts. Those indeed were very useful to this meeting. Before we move on to the next presentation, I had an information that Dr. Jeremy is having some technical challenge trying to join us, but he's still trying to. Once we get him on board, obviously, he would also be making his own remark. All right, so having said that, we move straight to the next presenter, who is also ready. John Sunday Ojo is a fellow at the Erasmus University, and of course he's currently based in the Netherlands, and he's got some very beautiful credentials when it relates to issues around defense and security. John, if you are ready, it would be nice if you take the floor. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Sunday Ojo, a Norfolk Fellow from Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And I'm also serve as a research advisor to the London Politica. Some of my publications are focused on the nexus between corruption in defense sector and the issue of terrorism, especially as regard to the Boko Haram issue in Nigeria. First, before we embark on the thematic areas, I would like to first introduce the ecology of defense sector in Nigeria. Firstly, if we look at the structure of a defense institution in Nigeria, we consider what I will call executive domineering. Key appointments are usually made by the president, which usually have a kind of ethnic coloration. Thirdly, when we talk about the absolute loyalty, the nature of politics in Nigeria, if you look at the general nomenclature, we observe that Nigeria is a place where politics is everything and everything is politics. So it becomes difficult, even if a political office holder within especially within parliament, who want to introduce a particular reform or something that we provide solution to the existing problem. If you don't belong to the actual caucus or you don't buy into the agenda of the government in power, it will be difficult to realize. And also, defense institution has been a source of capital accumulation. If we look at the previous political administration in Nigeria, we are getting there to be on the next. I observed that this institution, defense sector, has been employed to foster what I would call a kind of party agenda, especially in siphoning money from this sector to finance political parties. And also, authority within this sector is also personalized and shaped by the rulers' preferences, rather than any codified system of law. So this has been the ecology and the system of Nigerian defense sector. Is a kind of structure that that has been politicized, that has been ethnicized by those in power. Even if you look at the issue of appointments in this sector, it has ethnic coloration. So this is the ecology of Nigeria defense sector. Moving from that arena, we have to interrogate why Nigerian defense sector is vulnerable to corruption. We look at the issue of secrecy in the name of national security concern. Also, we have to consider ethnic politics, political patronage, and weak institutional accountability, and lack of competition. When we say lack of competition, is a kind of scenario when you have a single source, especially when you want to procure arms and ammunition, and this also facilitates or fosters corruption in the system. And also the uniqueness of the defense sector, which I will call defense exceptionalism. So these are the reasons why the defense sector is vulnerable to corruption in Nigeria. Looking at my case study, I use as the case of Dansuki Gate scandal and its implication on Nigerian defense capabilities. A situation whereby a particular amount of fund was allocated to fight the insurgency, and it was diverted for the purpose of political finance, or what I call party finance. So, and this has implication. It resulted into ineffective defense institution and prolonged war on Boko Haram insurgency. And it has implication for peace and security. I know some of us must have heard what happened a few days ago when 101 farmers were killed in Borno State by the Boko Haram. And military were continued complaining about a lack of funding, lack of equipment. And despite that, the money were being allocated into this sector, there was no result, and people are being killed every day. From that section, let's quickly move to defense corruption and challenges posed by COVID-19. During the lockdown period, we observed that there was a kind of human rights violation in the course of enforcing the law. This has also triggered the issue of the emergence of NSAS movement, which is also leads to food insecurity and inflation and some other things like that. If I want to look at my own personal experience as regards to the issue of NSAS movement in Nigeria and how the corruption that has been embedded in the defense sector triggers such movement. Immediately after my program, I think a few years back when I finished from University of Leeds, when I finished my MA, I came to Nigeria. So that very period, I just, when my laptop was faulty, I now asked one of my mentors, one of the guys that I was mentoring. to take me to a particular place where I supposed to repair. So along the road, we encountered this security operative, and the guy was asked to enter the van. I said, the laptop belongs to me. If you want to make any apprehension, you need to arrest me, not the guy. So he said, no, we have to arrest this guy. I said, on what basis? I needed to follow them to the station. On getting there, one of them called me, said, bros, you have to pay 20,000. I said, for what? What a kind of, what a system is. Even if you compare to all this, where I was coming from, I could not even compare. At the end of the day, I was able to release the guy. So this has been the nature of corruption in the defense sector in general. So it was part of those factors that triggered the issue of NSAS movement in Nigeria. From there, we have to look at the overview of the role of civilian oversight in Nigeria. They have the opportunity to hold government accountable for the mismanagement of defense funds. And also, they have been saddled with the responsibility of defining the legal framework for the defense sector, looking at the issue of regulating activities of the military, making law and policy, ratifying national security policy as presented by the executive. In this arena, I observed that that it also raises awareness against the misconduct of defense institutions. This role always been carried out by the civil society organization. But looking at the political terrain in Nigeria, it becomes difficult for civil society to function effectively due to some certain factors that I'm going to discuss. So what are the challenges associated with civilian oversight in Nigeria? These include culture of secrecy. So culture of secrecy, what I mean about that is that some of these documents that are needed to assess, it cannot be possible for this civilian or civil society organization to have access to the basic document, and also lack of independence, both in the parliament level and the civil society level. Some of these civil society organizations, they lack autonomy because some of them are being financed by the government in power. And also the near absence of a defense policy. This is also part of the issues, the challenges confronting civilian oversight in Nigeria. Moreover, when we talk about the issue of unholy alliance between the military and the civilian institutions, if we want to look at the case of Dansuki Gate, we will observe that there was a kind of alliance formation between the political office holders, the military, the retired generals, and some political big men, or what I will call political godfathers, that could determine the outcome of an election in Nigeria. So these are the major problems that make the terrain more difficult for civilian oversight. And also the issue of resistance against involvement of non-state civilian actors. Because the military, they usually look at themselves as being the issue of being the issue of supremacy. it also can be considered as one of the reasons why it is very difficult to have effective civilian oversight in Nigeria. From there, we will move to what I would call the burden of the past, from military to democratic regime, unchanging trend in defense oversight. The politics of old, or what I would call the politics of recycling, looking at the existing structure or existing governance system in Nigeria, we observe that the same set of people that have been ruling Nigeria from independence are the ones still ruling till today. They were once in the military, but now they are in the democratic political system. What difference can we observe in this kind of governance? This also poses a potent risk to the issue of oversight in Nigeria. From there, I will move to conditions for effective civilian oversight in Nigeria. What are the conditions? I suggest that creation and legalization of parliamentary trust group. This group will have access to sensitive details. They may constitute civil society organization, the retired military generals who have experience in the field, and also the recruitment of defense consultants into the committee. These people will have access to sensitive information in order to monitor the activities of defense sector. And also, there should be a kind of creation of platform for public support and engagement.
John, sorry to
conclusively,
if you could conclude now, please, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Conclusively, it is very important for civil society to hold government accountable. How can they achieve that? Backing up advocacy with solid documentation, employing research to influence public decision makers, and also making participation effective and influencing policy, mobilizing community around security issues, and effective monitoring of security sector budgets. Finally, making the skill and expertise of civil society available to the parliament and independent oversight institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Sunday Ojo. If you are just joining us, that was John Ojo, a fellow at the Erasmus University based in the Netherlands. And I really appreciate the fact that you also tried very hard to calibrate the ecosystem within the defense sector in Nigeria. And what struck me the most is that we seem to find some similarity in what is going on in Ukraine, and of course what we have on the ground here in Nigeria. And you described the fact that the National Assembly has bequeathed to the executive the management of the armed forces, which is a misnomer. And of course, you went ahead to describe some culture which you describe of secrecy, and of course the fact that nepotism in itself is also a very big situation in this part of the world, and that also suggests that corruption in itself is not particularly about graft. It means that there are other issues that borders around practice that also seem to be corrupt related. And of course, you mentioned the issue of the defense budget, which I strongly agree with you, requires some level of political interest. Thank you very much, John. So we move on now to the next speaker. I am not sure we have joining us already Dr. Jeremy, but we go on and yield the floor over to John Speller, who is the MP and Vice Chairman of the House of Commons Defense Committee in the UK. John Speller, if you are there, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and very pleased to be involved in this today. And as you said, I'm a Labour Member of Parliament, Vice Chairman of the Defence Committee. And when we were in government, I was at different times the Minister for the Armed Forces, Minister for Northern Ireland, Minister for Transport, and Deputy Chief Whip in the Parliament. Now, one of the issues that we are having to deal with is ministers very often get moved around by prime ministers, and you move into a new department. Too often, I think people ought to spend longer getting to know their department, because those three departments I mentioned, Northern Ireland, Transport and Defence, are all immensely complex in their internal workings. And my reply to people when they raised that question was that it wasn't our job to know all the answers as ministers, but it's very much our job to be able to ask the right questions. And that really is also a major role for a defence committee for parliamentary oversight. It's to ensure that you ask the right questions, because that not only helps to dig down and expose when there is incompetence, inefficiency, or corruption, but it also acts as very much of a dampening on those who would indulge in those sort of activities. If they know they are going to have to provide answers, not just to their ministers who they might be able to influence, but to a parliamentary committee with representatives of different parties, government and opposition, on those committees, then that is cautionary, and it really follows Justice Brandis' dictum in the United States that transparency is the most effective sunshine, and by which meaning transparency is the most effective disinfectant, and therefore that works very well in changing behaviours. Now there is a danger with that. And that's twofold. One is on the side of the committee, that the committee, and you see this in all countries, you have individuals or indeed parties who are mainly looking for the headline and to expose a corruption, genuine or perceived. That can play a positive role, but it can also have a negative effect, in that public servants and indeed ministers become completely driven by process, take far longer than they should do in making decisions, because they want to make sure that they can't be criticised later on. I would argue, for example, in a very contemporary manner, that our health ministers at the moment, in many cases, seem more focused on actually what they're going to say to an inquiry into the COVID-19 epidemic than actually on getting on and resolving many of the issues and doing it in real time. So that's an area that we do have to look at, and also to make sure that the people who are involved on the committee, and that becomes a matter of self-discipline within the committee, that they actually are focused on getting outcomes that are good for the country, and in the case of defence, good for defence, rather than just scoring political points, although political points may have an occasional role in this. So if I can just then briefly outline how our committees work. As I described it, you have members of parliament from all parties, based on basically on a ratio of the number of members that they have overall. The chairmanships of the committees are again divided up on that same ratio according to the strength of the parties in parliament, and there will be a discussion between the chief whips as to which party has which chairmanship. And then the chairman of those committees are elected by the whole of the parliament, by all members. And again, that's another constraint. So they're not just answerable to their own party apparat, they're also answerable to the parliament. And to be fair, in most cases, most reports that we have actually are unanimous reports. They're argued out, and you get across parties a general consensus in order to, in many cases, that's very uncomfortable for the government department concerned, both in terms of efficiency, more often, and sometimes actually also of dubious behavior as well. Now, although the impetus for having our committees partly came from the United States with their committees, there are significant differences. The major one is we do not have budgetary control, and that is what gives the huge power to our American equivalents. Indeed, when I'm in the United States, to describe my position, I say I'm the minority ranking member of the House Defense Committee, but we have nothing like their power and influence. What we do have is the ability to name and shame, the ability to publicize, the ability to create debates, and to focus public attention onto issues, and that can have a very significant effect. And that can mean that other parts of the system also get involved. And for example, the other government departments, such as the Treasury, if there is an exposure of over expenditure in one department, then that the Treasury can take a very considerable interest. And we also have a Public Accounts Committee, which looks not so much at the general policy, but at the efficiency and effectiveness and value for money. And interestingly enough, that has been a much more long-standing body than the various departmental committees. The chair of the Public Accounts Committee comes from the opposition, and it was always has actually one of the best offices in Parliament. And they also have a very substantial labour resource in the National Audit Office. I'm just going to get some water, just a second. I must say this is merely the symptoms of a common cold and not anything more dramatic, or certainly as far as I can see. At the same time, therefore, they have statutory powers and considerable ability, therefore, to force officials to come and address them and to provide their accounts. And their reports have real power. And our committees very often work together, so that we will look jointly, for example, at the carrier program, where they will be conducting an audit of the efficiency of expenditure, and we will also be looking at military purpose and future relations with allies in these matters. We also, as a select committee, then also look at policy areas. And you might say, well, how does that come into the foreign policy areas, into corruption? But you will have seen right the way across the world, considerable influence by certain external actors trying to influence the policies and the directions of our countries, notably and particularly within Eastern Europe, but right the way across Europe, and indeed into the United States in particular as well, by Russia, and in their immediate area, but also, for example, in Australia and in the United Kingdom and others, by China, basically by trying to bring in various individuals and awarding them contracts and problems, therefore, with financial institutions, but also with members of the legislature becoming involved and getting lucrative positions with companies or with entities, but which, of course, are subject ultimately to the control of the political apparatus in their respective countries. And again, we've done a report on Russia. We did a report on Huawei, the Chinese telecom communications provider, and that's led to a major discussion and debate, and indeed a shift in government policy here in the UK. So that shows the question of influence that we're able to have. Why does it matter for defence in all countries? Well, firstly, because one needs to make sure that our forces who put themselves into harm's way actually have the right equipment for the mission. In other words, to define what the mission is, and that doesn't get distorted and directed. What are the security threats facing our country? And at the same time, also that it is affordable, that we're not paying over the odds for it in order to especially pay money to middlemen, and that it is usable and will also be maintained. Again, an issue if the contracts have been fundamentally flawed. We also need to look at soldier. I say soldier, but obviously applies to Navy and airmen as well, at their welfare. And by that I mean particularly food rations and accommodation. And if you go back in now, the history of the British Armed Forces, Army and Navy in particular, there's been a whole history of corruption in the provision of those, and that undermines led to several mutinies in our history. But it undermines morale, and it undermines confidence in both the government and the nation which they're serving, and also on the immediate chain of command as well, and therefore means your forces are less effective. So it's not just about equipment, it is also about many of the basics that actually Napoleon's dictum that an army marches on its stomach, that actually is very important for the morale of our forces. And it also therefore impacts on allied interoperability. If there is suspicion in one's allies that one's forces are less effective because equipment is unusable or substandard, but also if the morale as a result is also weakened, then that makes one very concerned as to whether in an operation, whether those forces are going to be reliable. And that's a major problem for forces operating in multinational environments, in order as to the question as to whether you can effectively work together, whether you can trust each other, and whether, if it does come to conflict, whether you can be sure that they will still be there. So this affects widely across the armed forces, and the role of the committee all the time is also to make sure that the officers are looking after the welfare of their troops, are not, for example, sending them on exercises which are dangerous. There is an inherent level of danger, but needlessly dangerous. For example, if they're taking various medication for conditions when they're operating abroad. We had a big inquiry into the anti-malarial drug Lariam, and the unwillingness of the higher command to look at the problems that were arising. Again, all of this impacts on effectiveness of forces, and is a very important role for oversight, for asking the questions, and for demanding answers, and for doing that outside of the chain of command, but with the protection of parliamentary sovereignty. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies. That was John Speller, MP, the Vice Chairperson of the Commons Defense Committee. Thank you very much for giving us some tidbits around defense accountability infrastructure. And I think those were indeed very, very useful. And what particularly struck me the most was when you mentioned the budgetary control that you do not have. And I said, okay, that seemed to be like a cross-cutting situation, Ukraine, Nigeria, and now in the UK. But what you do that seemed to be slightly different is the fact that you have the capacity to name and shame. And of course, you're able to also create an environment for debate and convene a public hearing. And of course, you also talked about how people don't ask the right question. And at this point, I must honestly commend the TIDS for having spent the last 3-4 years supporting civil society coalition on how to ask the right question and how to indeed approach strategic institutions when it comes to issues that borders around defense and security. Thank you very much once again, John Speller. I'd like to encourage participants to please post questions into the chat room. Somebody will be there to take every bit of those, and of course we can respond to them. Unfortunately, Dr. Jeremy is not able to join us, so we just might have to go on, and of course that also provides us with additional time to use. Okay, so Natalie, I would pass the floor over to you now so that you can take the first shot with the Q&A session. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Sardine, and thank you to all three speakers. Apologies for interruptions, but we have got a good half hour now to discuss with each other, so that's great. So people are posting questions in the chat, so please do keep doing that. And just to get the ball rolling, I'd like to initially start with Elena from NACO and ask you, Elena, about how the situation of war in the east of Ukraine impacts on civil society's ability to undertake civilian oversight.
Thank you, Natalie. Well, definitely there is a serious impact, and it's a twofold impact. On the one side, because we have an active conflict, there is higher need for our government to classify things. Our threat to national security is not ephemeral, it's real, it's the Russian Federation. And this is why we hear a lot of explanations that, for example, even if something is procured and that particular thing is not really a weapon, it's something basic, but we don't want, say, the Russians know that we procure it, say, from Czech Republic, because they might influence the Czechs. So it makes the sense. And then we will not have the supply of that small part for our equipment. And this is why, of course, during the war, the secrecy is more legitimate, and it is a challenge for us as organization fighting for transparency and accountability. But the second impact, the other side of this coin, is that because we have an active conflict, the society feels very strongly about defense corruption. And when we have different incidents reported, different investigations, reports of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, something happens, journalists investigate, or even when we issue our report, there is a strong reaction from the society. There is a very strong interest among the media because, you know, during the war, defense corruption, it's a huge crime against your country, against the national security of your country, and it threatens directly the life of our soldiers if the equipment is malfunctioning because it was not produced correctly and somebody dies. So it's a very sensitive topic, and because essentially I would summarize, because of this conflict, our topic stays very, very actualized among the society, which helps us to promote reform.
Thank you, Elena. Saludin?
Thank you very much, Elena. The next question from me goes to John. John, I'd like you to, from our engagement with the defense sector, there are challenges in the oversight about defense expenditure. And the access to information has also been a very key challenge and setback. Based on your research, how can we effectively advocate for a systemic progress in these areas?
Yeah. In order to address the issue of secrecy in the defense sector, my suggestion is this. With the creation of a parliamentary trust group, which we include civil society organization, defense consultant, retired military officers, and some selected members of the parliament. If such a group is created, it will give opportunity to have access to some classified document, the one that classified as document that can be considered as maybe difficult to access, especially as regard to national security issue. I think if this group have access to this document and they can feed back the parliament on this particular issue or their findings, I think it will mitigate or minimize the issue of corruption in the defense sector. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Natalie, I'll yield the floor over to you. Natalie, are you there?
Apologies, I was still on mute. Yes, so this is a question to John Speller about to reflect on the situation in Nigeria, where members of the National Assembly complain about a lack of resources and lack of readiness for the defence sector to be subject to civilian scrutiny. And I wonder if you, from your experience, if you have suggestion to your Nigerian peers in terms of how to convince the military and the public in terms of effective legislative oversight.
I go back to a point I made earlier that the politicians within Parliament also have to take their share of responsibility to ensure that they are not using inquiries merely as political weapons in order to pursue a battle with the government, and that they've got to make clear that their prime concern is to ensure that the military is capable of performing its task, and also, quite frankly, to ensure the military actually is inclined to perform its task, and again is not being used in a political way, but is defending the country and not necessarily a particular government. I think it's also to say to many in the military who will recognize that if there are those within the system who are corrupt or incompetent, and those are not exclusive, many can be, some can be both, that therefore that undermines the effectiveness of the military in dealing with external or internal threats. And that would particularly be the case, for example, with dealing with Boko Haram and others. But at the same time, it undermines the morale of the troops. And it must be immensely dispiriting for honest and dedicated officers, where if there are those within the military, particularly within upper reaches of a military where those decisions are made, who are susceptible to corruption. Not least also when I was mentioning about the terms and conditions of ordinary soldiers, who therefore will find that they are not receiving the supplies or the accommodation that they are entitled to, because money is being siphoned off. So there's a very real interest for those within the armed forces who are dedicated to their role and being professional and honest, that actually there should be substantial civilian oversight to ensure that that continues.
Thank you, John. Saladin, I'll hand over to you now for questions in the chat. So please, people do keep posting there if there's things you would like to ask.
All right, thank you very much, Natalie. And of course, we encourage participants to please keep rolling in those information. And Olena, you seem to be quite popular in the chat room, quite a number of questions out there for you. But of course, the first one that I'd like to ask you, someone really wants to know if you can elaborate on some of the key issues slowing or preventing implementation of reforms, which you mentioned.
Yeah, sure. In my opinion, the key reason for the delay is like internal bureaucratic reason that happened here in Ukraine. During the summer, the new institution was established. It is called the Ministry for Strategic Industries. And this ministry basically took over leadership of this reform from former leaders of the reform. The former leaders were the Parliamentary Committee, the Ministry of Economy, and Ministry of Defense. And because their leadership in those ministries changed, and because this new ministry, which is not very pro-reform, was created, basically they don't like to implement that something that other people developed before them, and they took a pause to consider it. So that's essentially like the detailed explanation. But to give like a broader picture, you know, it's inevitable dynamic that after every revolution, we have very short window. And if you call the election of President Zelensky an electoral revolution, because indeed we had a person who is not a politician, who's not part of this current political class elected, and who promised all this anti-corruption reform, well, his window was essentially 6 months after the election. And at that time, the reform was happening fast. We were helping, everybody was excited. And this is the time when the law was adopted, the procurement law. And now we have this inevitable thing that usually happens after the window is closed or closing.
So essentially, it is a function of political will, which should be re-emphasized again. Okay, so I get to you, Dr. Sunday. Are there specific open access tools or resources that can be used by civil society members to monitor the defense sector in their respective countries? Do you think any of such tools exist? Please, we will yield that floor over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, currently there is no source, or there is no source for any opportunity or any landscape for monitoring such an event currently. If I want to look at the Nigerian case study, I think at times as a researcher we rely on report. At times we rely on the media reports. At times we rely on maybe interview, especially from anti-corruption institution. to monitor the trend of corruption in the country, especially in the defense sector. So I think within the anti-corruption institution, we can get details that we can use to explore, to foster our research about defense corruption.
Yeah,
okay, I think the FOI Act.
Sorry, if I could just seize the mic to give a little plug for the Government Defence Integrity Index that Transparency International Defence and Security produces, because what that gives is an assessment of risk within 86 different sectors around the world. So it doesn't give you all the solutions, but it shows where the high risk areas are and can act as a basis for civil society to start to work out how they might organise around defence sector corruption risks. So I have to give that little plug. Sorry, Saladin.
No, thank you very much, Natalia. As a matter of fact, you took that off me. I was actually just going to mention that. And for me, it is a fantastic tool that gives varying typologies and areas that civil society organization can use as areas to monitor, and of course it provides clear indicators that can also be used. And of course, from the government side, we also have the Freedom of Information Act, which is also a very key instrument that we can use to access information. It might not be very effective, but of course there are existing tools that we can use to push through. And of course we have the BPP Act, and of course there are some of those existing instruments. Thank you very much, Natalie, for that information. I do not know if John Speller, MP, would be the right person to answer this question. But of course, I'd like to be a little bit very generous to ask him, because not because he's within the civil society community, but he might have some very good practice that he wants to share. Do you think that civil society often suffers some level of backlash, particularly from security forces, when they engage very strongly within the defense arena? And do you think it is dangerous to do so? And what exactly would be your own advice to civil society organizations working within space? And that was because you talked about asking the right question. And I think it would be very good if you're able to highlight for us what you think in this regard.
Well, I think that also depends on the level of control over security forces and agencies. So, for example, in the United Kingdom Parliament, we also have a committee that has oversight of intelligence and security. The members of that have to be at a classified level, and they meet off-site from Parliament in secure premises, whereby they can be briefed by operatives of those agencies, and they issue reports on activities. So therefore, there is that degree of oversight. There is also civilian oversight from departments. For example, the Home Office is responsible for MI5, which is the Domestic Intelligence Agency, and the Foreign Office is responsible for MI6, the SIS, and also for GCHQ, the Signals and Intelligence System, which of course has grown enormously over recent years. So therefore, there is that ability to have a degree of oversight, whether elements within that operate, but I think that's less of a problem in the United Kingdom, although we do have a controversy at the moment as to the extent to which units of the Metropolitan Police infiltrated a number of movements, some of them highly political and revolutionary, some of them probably less so, and that's a matter of some considerable controversy at the moment. But as I said, I do recognize that is a favorable position compared with those in some other countries where you do have fundamentally elements of the deep state which might be looking at reprisals or exposure of individuals who are asking those questions. I go back to one of the fundamental points, which is about establishing commonality of purpose and interest. And that is that for those within the system who actually want to focus on the prime purpose of defense and security, which is the protection of the country and its citizens, the corrupt elements within those systems are actually working even more against them than they are against others. And that's why it's very important that those who are investigating and questioning actually agree with the prime purpose of the forces, rather maybe than some of those who don't think, for example, that we should have any significant defense capability in this country anyway. Those messages never get through, and frankly, they don't help in maintaining honest and effective forces.
Thank you very much, John. I agree with you completely. Of course, it is also a context that we need to begin to interrogate as it varies from country to country. Olena, I will come to you again to ask you, is there any limitation to how far civil society organizations in Ukraine can demand for transparency? And of course, that question is being asked because of the situation we have here in Nigeria, where almost everything is classified, from the procurement of uniforms to boots to stationaries. What will you want to describe as the experience from Ukraine in this particular regard? Because you also highlighted very strongly the issue of procurement while you were making your presentation.
Yeah, well, to answer the first question, the limitation is the law on state secrecy, and essentially we use this tool a lot, the Freedom of Information Act, and we ask questions on anything we want, and then sometimes we get answer that according to the national legislation, this particular information is classified, and this is our limitation. That's it. And sometimes it is information not like top secret information. Sometimes we are given official information with their clause, like with the condition that we will not publicize it. So when we, of course, work in different groups, when we facilitate those reforms, we have a lot of official information, which is not public information, and we use it to help advance reform. But like this issue about boots and clothing, in Ukraine, when the war began, the country was unprepared for this because it was the failure of our policymakers. They did not consider that Russia is a threat. So everybody was so shocked that we now have to do procurement under the conditions of war with Russia, that they classified procurement of boots and other supplies for the armed forces, because they were confused. They thought maybe Russians can calculate our troops based on number of boots that we bought. But of course, that didn't make any sense, because Russians have other sources to learn how many troops we have. And moreover, our security service was so much penetrated by Russian security service that we practically didn't have any secrets from Russians anyway, because we used to be in one country at some point, and still that legacy was continuing at the time of the beginning of the conflict. So yeah, they, under pressure of society, they declassify this information. Now, when we talk about procurement, say MOD, 45% is classified and 55% is open, and you can go to our procurement website, prozoro.gov.ua, and you see that you can see what is being procured, the fuel, clothing, food, yeah, everything basically apart from armaments and services is open.
All right, thank you very much. That was indeed useful. I was going to ask you if there is a conflict between the secrecy law, which you mentioned, and the Access to Information, Freedom of Information Act that you also talked about. But if you have time, you can just post that in the chat room for people to see, because it is very important to see if you encounter any sort of conflict of those two legislations in the course of doing your work. Okay, so we need to close in 5 minutes, but I would want John to take 1 minute as a closing thoughts, and of course every of the panelists will take 1 minute, then of course I will yield the floor over to Natalie to give us her closing thoughts, and of course we would believe it. 60 seconds. John, what's the way forward?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the way forward as regard to my findings so far on defense corruption is to hold the defense institution accountable. And if we continue relying on the parliament to do that, I think we are going nowhere. So it becomes fundamental for civil society organizations to continue to advocate and to ensure that the government are accountable to every activity, especially as regards to the issue of defense procurement and the defense activities in general.
Thank you very much, John. I'll go to John Speller. What's the way forward from your parliamentary point of view?
2 ways, I think. One is that is for parliamentarians across countries to work together. We've established a very good relationship, for example, with the Defense Committee of the Assemblée Nationale in France, have done one joint report and are moving on to, would have been, apart from COVID, moving on to other ones, because then we can see how our interests can pull together. I would, however, say, contrary to the previous John, I think it is very important that wherever possible, these activities are funneled through Parliament, because ultimately that's where the budgetary decisions get made. That's where that's where the political decisions. That's where security issues and foreign policy issues get ironed out, and it is absolutely crucial, therefore, that parliamentarians are involved, partly because of parliamentary protection, but also because the interests of national security and these questions of overclassification and so on, which very often are more designed to protect individuals within the system than they are to protect our national security, that's where those can be resolved. There's a role for other organizations, but fundamentally, this has to be resolved through politics.
Absolutely. This has to be resolved through politics. Elena, you want to give us your parting words?
Yeah, sure. Just a few sentences. Well, it really depends on a country, which institution, which group will play the leading role in the civil oversight of a defense. It depends on capacities. In countries with strong capacities of state institutions, of the parliament plays this role. In countries like Ukraine, where essentially the capacities of NGOs is sometimes stronger than capacity of the state, they take over this role. But I completely agree with the previous statement that it is important that not NGOs play the leading role in this, but the institutions that will exist in this state, in this country, for centuries, and that will have people in place who will maintain this knowledge for decades, say in some apparatus, say, of the committee in the parliament. And this is why NACO also devotes a lot of attention to the goal of strengthening parliamentary oversight over defense sector, and we are also helping. We're now facilitating exchange of experience, and we really acknowledge it's very important.
I apologize, Natalie. Thank you, Olena. Thank you very much for those thoughts. Can I just get back to Natalie to give us her closing remarks? Thank you.
Thank you, Saladin. I'd like to thank very much all the participants. They've been really, really interesting presentations. And there's still a couple of questions that haven't been answered, and I apologize for that, but I think what it shows is the level of interest in this topic. And I think the three different examples have kind of shown really clearly how context matters, and both in terms of what's going on in a country, but also the particular moments of opportunity that there are where corruption may increase, but there may also be opportunities to act on that corruption. I think it's also really highlighted for me the end outcomes of all of this, both in terms of the impact of defence sector corruption on civilians and also on the people serving in armed forces. And there's some sort of shared commonality there in trying to tackle this issue, as there is between strengthening Parliament's ability to have oversight of the defence sector and also civil society more broadly. So there's an awful lot there, and I feel like the discussion could go on for a lot longer, but we have somehow brought it in a minute on time. So I'd like to thank everybody, both presenters and participants.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure facilitating this session. I want to request that participants should please go to the dashboard, click onto file, and of course, there are quite a number of resources that are available there for interesting read. Thank you so much. I think we'll draw the curtain at this point. Please enjoy the rest of the program. Have a very pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.